If there's one thing you should know about me, it's that I absolutely love stupid, obscure, and outright ridiculous video game peripherals. Another thing you should know is that I love the PS1, and I consider it my favourite console of all time. So, when you combine those two things, you know you're gonna have my interest. Enter the PS1 UltraRacer controller. At first glance it sort of looks like a remote control for an RC car, but nope, this is actually a fully functional PS1 controller designed to work primarily with racing games. So let's take a look at this ridiculous thing and see if it might be worth investing in for your own setup too. The packaging of the UltraRacer is very minimal. Inside the box is just some cardboard which holds the controller in place and a set of instructions congratulating us on our purchase. That's pretty nice. More controllers should give us positive reinforcement after we buy them. The controller itself matches the grey design of the PS1 console and the official PS1 controllers, which makes it look quite authentic despite the fact it quite clearly isn't. The box itself even states that it's not sponsored, endorsed or approved by Sony, which makes me worry a little bit about the quality here. Interestingly, there's no date information on the box or on the instructions, and there seems to be no record I can find online as to when this actually came out. I suspect it was released fairly early into the PS1's life though, considering the instructions state that the way this works is by mimicking the twisting controls of Namco's Nijicon controller. But instead of twisting the entire controller, you instead just rotate a wheel. The Namco Nijicon was one of the first third-party controllers available on the PS1, and the fact that the UltraRacer was using that as the basis for its functionality makes me assume it may have been released a short while after to try and replicate its critical, but not so much commercial, success. The UltraRacer is a very, very strange design. Something that's probably worth pointing out is that there was an N64 variant of the UltraRacer, and I heavily suspect that the N64 version might have released first. The reason I say this is because, well, look at this. It's basically the middle handle of an N64 controller, but with all of the buttons from the standard controller squished onto it, and a massive wheel in place of the analog stick. It even has the rumble pack port on the back, which has been filled in for the PS1 version. There isn't even any of the regular PlayStation face buttons here, with X, square, circle and triangle being replaced with A, B, L and this weird 1/2 button. The L and 1/2 buttons are actually analog, which means that they can detect the amount of pressure that you're putting on them. This is similar to how most modern controllers tend to have triggers that are pressure sensitive, which do things like make you go faster in driving games the more pressure you put onto them. In theory, these analog buttons would give you a greater degree of control over your braking in racing games, which is actually a pretty awesome idea. We have these tiny arrow buttons which replace the D-pad inputs, and then we have 4 buttons on the wheel itself which are assigned to L1, L2, R1 and R2 by default. I'm not exactly sure why these are placed so prominently on the controller. I know some racing games use these buttons to activate the handbrake, but I feel like this was more of a PS2 era thing. On the PS1, most games seem to assign this function to square or straight up not even have handbrake controls. So maybe these buttons on the wheel was so that you could easily shift gears up and down, but it's still awkward placement nonetheless. We also have this back trigger button which you can not only pull forward but also push back for an additional input. This trigger is also analog, meaning that in racing games, the more that you pull the trigger, the faster you'll pick up speed. Finally, we have the set button, which is used in one of the most standout features of the UltraRacer. It's actually possible to partially customize the function of each button on this controller. So if you're playing a game and you find that R2 activates the brakes, by pressing the set button you can change the R2 input to a different button on the controller to make it more comfortable. Not every button's function can be changed however, with the L, 1/2, start and set button itself being locked into whatever input they're automatically assigned by each game. But this is still a great feature that's bound to come in useful in certain games. But speaking of games, let's plug this sucker in and slap some games on, shall we? I've looked at a list of games that are compatible with the Negicon, so in theory all of those games should also work with the Ultra driver too, considering that it's imitating that controller's functionality. So let's start off with some good old-fashioned V-Rally. This was actually one of the very first video games I ever played. My first console was the PS1 and I got it bundled with Rayman and V-Rally. I always preferred Rayman, but because I only had access to 2 games at the time and V-Rally was my only multiplayer game, I ended up playing this a fair bit too. Good times. The biggest hurdle to overcome with the UltraRacer here was getting my head around the controls. For some reason V-Rally was a bit awkward at first because you don't simply pull the trigger to make the car move forward. You have to first knock the trigger up and then pull it back down, and I don't know exactly why this is. The menus are also quite difficult to navigate, again sometimes requiring you to pull the trigger in different directions just to simply select an option. It's a bit weird, but you know what? Once you get over this and wrap your head around the basic controls, this is actually quite good. Like, surprisingly good. Because the steering wheel on the controller is obviously analog, this means you have far greater control over your turning than what you would have with a D-pad. With a D-pad you're either not turning at all because you're not pressing anything, or you're full on turning because you are pressing something and there's no in-between. With a wheel though, you can make slight adjustments to your turns, which gives you far more accurate movement options. The wheel itself actually feels really good. It's got this sort of spongy grip on the outside to avoid your hand slipping off, and the wheel mechanism is quite tightly fitted, which almost gives the game a bit of tactile feedback with the wheel snapping back to its neutral position when you let it go. It's like the car is putting up a certain amount of resistance when you try to turn it, which feels surprisingly realistic. At the same time though, it doesn't feel stiff either, it's just the right amount of resistance. I've seen quite a lot of people online saying that this isn't a very good controller, so maybe I'm just a driving game novice or something, but I'm actually enjoying using this. But okay, V-Rally works well with the UltraRacer, but what about the ultimate driving game on the PS1? Gran Turismo 2 isn't actually featured on this compatibility list I found on Wikipedia, so I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't work. But what do you know, it not only works, but I would say that the controller map in here is even better than what it was in V-Rally, with the menus being easy to navigate and the cars working exactly as you'd expect. This is pretty great. At this point though, I feel like I now have this responsibility to the UltraRacer to check every single racing game that I have for the PS1 just to make sure it doesn't have secret compatibility. After all, if Gran Turismo 2 wasn't on that compatibility list, then there could be others that are missing too. Despite Destruction Derby 1 and 2 supposedly being compatible, I can confirm that Destruction Derby Raw doesn't work with the UltraRacer. You can get to the main menu, but at that point no inputs do anything, which locks you out of progressing. Driver 1 and 2 are in a similar situation, not even allowing you to get past the title screen. Even Micro Machines V3, which would have been absolutely perfect with the UltraRacer due to its RC car remote control design, doesn't work either. I even tried a bit of an obscure PS1 racing game called London Racer, but again, no dice. And that, unfortunately, is all of the standard racing games that I have in my PS1 collection. Considering it didn't work with Micro Machines, I doubt that it would work with any other kart racers. Right? Well, to my utter disbelief, not only does the UltraRacer work with Crash Team Racing, it's actually probably the game that supports it the best. No other game has allowed me to navigate menus by twisting the wheel, and yet here, you can twist the wheel to select your character. Talk about attention to detail. Despite Crash Team Racing requiring you to press a greater combination of buttons than a normal racing game due to its drifting mechanic and the usage of items, this is actually completely playable with the UltraRacer. I was managing to drift around corners, take shortcuts, and do everything I can do with a normal controller, and the shocking thing is that it actually felt quite good. But surely after that, it can't be that any more kart racers would work with this thing, right? I mean, take Lego Racers. This isn't even featured on that compatibility list, so there's no way that this thing would work, right? Yep, it works. Full-on UltraRacer compatibility, which just like with Crash Team Racing, actually feels quite good. Somebody with a bigger racing game collection than me needs to go ahead and test every single game with the UltraRacer, because clearly it works with more games than it initially seems. Now, I do want to reiterate that I'm not normally a big racing game sort of guy. It could be that this is actually completely rubbish, especially when compared to something like an actual full-sized steering wheel controller, but even so, as a casual racing game player, I'm actually impressed. I honestly thought that this was going to be utter rubbish and just a bit of a joke, but I would seriously consider using this instead of a standard controller with certain games. Probably not the kart racer ones due to needing to press so many buttons, which can be a bit awkward with the UltraRacer, but stuff like Gran Turismo and V-Rally, yeah, I can see myself using this. My biggest complaint here isn't really the UltraRacer's fault. Not every game was created to be compatible with the Nijicon controller, and because of that, even games that would theoretically be possible to play just straight up don't detect your inputs. It's a shame there wasn't some sort of workaround for this, where the UltraRacer could replicate a DualShock controller's analog stick or something, because I would love to play something like Croc with this thing. Imagine playing through something like Final Fantasy VII, but with a steering wheel. That's the sort of stuff I love. Something interesting though that I unfortunately can't test out for myself due to not having the games is that the Nijicon, and by extension the UltraRacer, is compatible with a selection of Namco arcade compilations. So it does have very limited utility outside of driving games. I'm assuming that turning the wheel would move your ship in Galaga, which actually sounds like it would be pretty good, but as for what it would do in something like Pac-Man, I have no idea. It even has compatibility with a couple of PS2 games, with Wipeout Fusion and the Japanese exclusive Nam collection being two of them. Just to take things a step further, I did actually connect the UltraRacer to my PC using a PS2 controller adapter, and it was recognised by RetroArch, which allowed me to fully customize its inputs, which effectively makes any game functional. I tried out Croc and it was playable for sure, but for some reason I would always rotate whenever I jumped. Maybe with enough tinkering in the settings I could stop this, but just know it is theoretically possible to play anything with this if you can plug it into a PC. But what I really want to see is somebody take this and complete Dark Souls with it. After all, it has been done with the Donkey Konga bongos, but now I think it's time for the reign of the UltraRacer. But anyway, thanks so much for watching this stupid video about this stupid steering wheel controller. If you enjoyed it, drive into that like button, reverse into the subscribe, and I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and I'll see you in the next one.